Good afternoon. It's Monday, June 13th. I'm Aryeh O'Sullivan, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. The Orlando terror attack in the United States headlined today's cabinet meeting. Here to bring us up to date is IBA's political reporter, Kalev Ben-David. Kalev?
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu opened today's cabinet meeting with expressions of sympathy and support for the U.S. in the wake of the Orlando massacre. The Prime Minister related the Florida attack to the greater global struggle against radical Islam, saying, "This terror threatens the entire world and requires, above all, that the enlightened nations under threat will unite to fight against it." The opposition joined in condemning the massacre, with Zionist Union leader Isaac Herzog expressing outrage over the forces of hatred, violence, and murder manifested in this heinous attack. Two Knesset members who belong to Israel's gay community also weighed in. The Likud's Amir Ohana said, "The Western world must realize it is under attack and must fight back against the intolerant ideology of radical Islam." The Zionist Union's Itzik Shmuli tweeted, "This is a struggle between those who believe in freedom and those who want to eliminate it." Kulanu MK Michael Oren, a former ambassador to the U.S., expressed the view that the incident would boost the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. If the motive had been hatred against the gay community, it would have helped Hillary Clinton. But as it is turning out that the motive was jihadist Islam, it will serve and greatly strengthen Donald Trump, Oren told Channel 10. Aryeh?
Well, Kalev, those are pretty interesting statements by Michael Oren. Has it had an impact?
Yes, there has been some negative reaction from several journalists, especially in the U.S., who have taken his remarks to almost as a recommendation to Donald Trump to exploit the Muslim identity of the shooter in the Orlando massacre. Michael Oren subsequently tweeted that he had not been making a recommendation. He'd only been offering an analysis of what he said believed Donald Trump would do. But of course, it's not the first time Oren has made statements, analytical statements about the U.S. politics that have angered some people in the U.S. He's perhaps have to remember he's a politician now and not an analyst, and perhaps be a little more careful and circumspect in his remarks.
Kalev, have anybody made the connection between the Orlando attack and the Sarona attack last week in Tel Aviv?
Well, certainly, Aryeh, here they have. I mean, Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid made out a statement directly linking the two incidents, and of course the common link being radical Islamic terror. But of course, not everybody in the U.S. is making that link. There are several commentators and politicians treating this more as a hate crime against homosexuals than as a jihadist, radical Islamic attack. And of course, President Obama did not mention terror or terrorism in his initial reaction to the attack, drew a lot of criticism from conservative critics and of course from the Republicans in the U.S.
Thanks, Kalev. Prime Minister Netanyahu extended his condolences to the families of the victims of the shooting attack in Orlando, Florida, saying Israel stands shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in fighting terror. In Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, members of the country's gay rights movements held solidarity rallies. And last night, the Tel Aviv municipality building lit up in solidarity with the city of Orlando. IBA's Margot Dudkevich has this report.
Flags on federal buildings were flown at half-mast across the United States today as a stunned American public mourned the victims of the Orlando club shooting. 50 people were gunned down and killed and 53 injured in the attack described as the country's worst mass shooting attack in its history. While the Islamic State claimed responsibility for the shooting, warning more attacks would come, their claims have yet to be verified. Omar Mateen, the 29-year-old American citizen of Afghan descent who perpetrated the attack at the Pulse, a gay nightclub, reportedly called 911 about 20 minutes into the shooting, pledging allegiance to the Islamic State and mentioning the Boston Marathon bombers. It was close to 2 in the morning when he entered the club, armed with a handgun and an assault rifle, despite security posted at the front entrance. The club was packed full of revelers on the dance floor when he opened fire.
You're sitting there having a great time at a club, and then you hear what sounds like fireworks or balloons popping, and you assume it's part of the show. And then when you hear people start screaming and the sound doesn't stop and people start falling, you realize it's not a show anymore. And at that point, I realized I needed to get out.
Some patrons hid in the restrooms calling police and texting friends and family for help. Mateen exchanged words with police outside before special SWAT teams entered the building and rescued those trapped inside. Mateen was shot and killed in an exchange of gunfire with police.
As Americans, we grieve the brutal murder, a horrific massacre of dozens of innocent people. We pray for their families who are grasping for answers with broken hearts. We stand with the people of Orlando who have endured a terrible attack on their city. Although it's still early in the investigation, we know enough to say that this was an act of terror and an act of hate. And as Americans, we are united in grief, in outrage, and in resolve to defend our people. I just finished a meeting with FBI Director Comey and my Homeland Security and National Security advisors. The FBI is on the scene and leading the investigation in partnership with local law enforcement.
Mateen's father, Sadiq, claimed his son's shooting rampage had nothing to do with religion, saying his son was disgusted after seeing two men kissing in front of his wife and child in Miami some time ago. He insisted no one was aware of his son's plans, saying the entire family was shocked. The imam of the local mosque Mateen often attended described him as a quiet person.
I was shocked, and I felt so bad for all the innocent poor people who were killed. And then it was a double, triple fold tragedy for us that something happened and it has a link and a relationship to us. So I was much more in shock and in tragedy than anybody else.
Hours after the attack, federal agents searched Mateen's home. He worked as a security guard at the G4S Secure Solution, one of the largest private security firms in the world, and had permits to purchase firearms legally. In the past, he had been interviewed by the FBI in 2 terror-related cases, but was not under surveillance at the time of Sunday's shooting. Moga Dudkevich, IBA News.
Israel today eased restrictions on the southern Hebron town of Yatta, just days after sealing it off in the wake of last week's deadly shooting. The 2 terrorists involved in last week's attack at the Sharona market, in which 4 Israelis were murdered, are from this town. Hours after the shooting, the army entered Yatta, sealing off access routes and conducting house-to-house searches. Today, the army permitted residents to enter and leave the town after undergoing inspections, with the exception of Palestinians aged 15 to 25. The army also lifted the general closure that had been imposed on the West Bank and Gaza during the Shavuot holiday. 2015 saw the highest number of Palestinian and Israeli casualties in the West Bank and in Israel since the UN records began in 2005. This according to a report published by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs this morning. Aylon Hassan-Levy has the details.
The report, Fragmented Lives, attributed the figures to the upsurge in violence at the end of 2015, including a sharp rise in stabbing, ramming and shooting attacks and clashes with Israeli forces. It noted that most Palestinian fatalities were suspected perpetrators of attacks on Israelis and that most injuries occurred in the context of clashes with Israeli forces. Despite criticism of Israeli policies, especially regarding the naval blockade on Gaza and planning restrictions on the West Bank, the report highlighted certain positive steps. In Gaza, OCHA welcomed the significant increase in Gazan residents and goods moving through Israeli crossings, as well as the expansion of the fishing zone. And on the West Bank, it welcomed the easing of restrictions on movement, including the removal of checkpoints and roadblocks. Among recommendations for Israel, the report called on Israel to end what it termed the collective punishment of the blockade on Gaza and to reverse the creation and expansion of Israeli settlements. It urged Palestinians to cease all attacks on Israeli civilians, to investigate compliance with international humanitarian law, and to work towards the creation of a unity government between Fatah and Hamas.
75 years since the Farhud, the wartime pogrom against the Jews of Baghdad, has been commemorated around the world. IBA's Aylon Aslan Levy spoke to Edwin Black, New York Times bestselling author of the Farhud, Roots of the Arab-Nazi Alliance in the Holocaust.
The Farhud was June 1st and June 2nd of 1941. It was an Arab-Nazi attempt to exterminate the Jews of Baghdad and actually all of Iraq. When I say it was done by Arab Nazis, I don't mean that they were Arab fascists. I mean, they were actually Arabs who idolized Adolf Hitler, who had adopted National Socialism, Nazism, many of whom had actually marched in the torchlight parades of Nuremberg. They marched the homes with a khamsa. Babies were cut in half and thrown into the Tigris River. Parents were murdered in front of their children. Daughters were raped in front of their parents. It was a rampage of 2 days.
Everybody has heard of Kristallnacht, but the Farhud has slipped into obscurity. Why?
Because the victims were Sephardic, and most of the Holocaust historians and most of the Holocaust museums from Washington to California have defined the Holocaust as Hitler's attempt to destroy European Jewry. So the fact that these Jews were somewhat south of Europe and somewhat east of Europe, including those in Tunisia who were 32 concentration camps, this was totally ignored.
Would it be right, therefore, to understand the Farhud as part of the Holocaust and all of Iraqi Jewry, therefore, as Holocaust survivors?
It was the Kristallnacht of the Sephardic community. It was one of many, many, many pogroms in the Arab world, but it was done with the Nazis, for the Nazis, and it is certainly part of Hitler's effort to destroy the Jews. What we have done is we have finally understood what Hitler always meant. He had a war not against the European Jews, but all the Jews in the world.
What explains the world's silence on the question of Jewish refugees from Arab lands compared to the excessive attention given to Arab refugees?
The reason that there's two classes of refugee is because two classes were set up. The 850,000 Jews were ignored by the world. They were unter-refugees, sub-refugees, even though they're covered by the same law. Meanwhile, the Palestinians were created as uber refugees. It was not under international law as soon as you are absorbed. It's a birthright. It shows the lie that Israel was a congregation of Ukrainians and Polish and Brooklyners, and shows that this expulsion changed Israel from a haven for European Jewry to a true Mideast country.
This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Farhud. How is it being commemorated around the globe?
It was my decision to launch a whirlwind series of commemorations. I started in the House of Representatives. We lit 27 candles for each century of Iraqi Jewish existence that was snuffed out. We actually snuffed them out. We blew 8.5 Tukiyot, shofar blasts, to commemorate the 850,000 Jews who were expelled. I went to New York, we repeated that. I flew to London, we repeated that with Ambassador Mark Regev. We had the culmination, the final of 4 commemorations. That was in the Knesset under Ksenia Svetlova, who rose to the occasion with partners Stand With Us, and we made it happen.
Many people argue that the question of Jewish refugees from Arab lands should be raised in peace negotiations with the Palestinians or in a regional settlement with the Arab world. Is that reasonable?
It doesn't matter. The property was seized. The people were victimized. There will be no justice without recognition, and no recognition unless we tell the story and people hear us loud and clear.
Nexar, an Israeli startup smartphone app aimed at making driving on the road safer, aims to build a network of drivers that will prevent accidents and improve driving skills. The app is operated with a dash cam, like a road camera, and footage is saved in the device, and later, when the user is connected to Wi-Fi, the data can be downloaded on the Nexar's cloud, freeing up storage space. On the road, the app can determine whether cars around you are being driven by good or bad drivers and can provide complete documentation of traffic accidents.
The uniqueness of Nexar is that it works in real time, and it uses all of the sensors of the phone, particularly the camera, but also other sensors, to create real-time trajectories of every car on the road, and then predict when accidents are about to happen, warn you. Same time, if an accident does happen, we have full reconstruction capability of the event. So if you're not at fault, you have all the evidence to get out of a situation.
And in the Judean desert, there was a dramatic rescue of 3 motorcyclists who found themselves dehydrated and exhausted. They had lost their way in the Tekoa Canyon, and as night fell, were unable to navigate themselves out of their predicament. At that point, volunteers from the Police Desert Rescue Unit, aided by an Air Force helicopter, were able to locate and make their way to the stranded trio and bring them home to safety. Afterwards, police called on hikers and other sportsmen to wear proper clothing and equip themselves with adequate water supplies if they head out into nature. And if you're into yoga, tomorrow and every Tuesday night until July, there will be a free yoga session for the public on the southern deck of the port of Tel Aviv. Starting last week, hundreds of people gathered to participate in the yoga exercise to celebrate Yoga Month. During the sunset hour, they were guided by American yoga instructor Rocky Heron, who flew in especially to guide the participants in the Blessing of the Sun exercise. The event was a collaboration of the Port of Tel Aviv and Ella Yoga. Tomorrow and every Tuesday night until July. And here's some good news. A group of high school seniors who spent the Passover holiday vandalizing an ancient citadel in Ashdod spent the Shavuot holiday cleaning it. The Antiquities Authority said the 5 youth, who are about to be drafted into the Army, came forward after the public condemnation of their paint party, which defaced the 1,300-year-old citadel. They said they regretted their actions and wanted to repair what they had done. Under the guidance of expert restorers, they worked to remove the paint and glitter from the ancient stones and clean up the site for visitors. The high schoolers vowed they'd never do it again. Finance Minister Moshe Kachlon announced today that he has reached several agreements with the Bank of Israel that will pave the way for the establishment of the first new bank in Israel in 47 years. Kachlon's announcement comes just before the release of the final report of the Strom Commission, which was established to increase competition in the banking sector. Kachlon and Bank of Israel Governor Karnit Flug had differed over the Commission's interim proposals, with Flug opposing its recommendations that the country's 2 biggest banks, Leumi and Hapoalim, no longer be allowed to issue their own credit cards. Kachlon has pledged to bring more competition into the country's bank sector in order to lower banking fees for the average consumer. At this hour, fire crews are battling to quash the flames of a 15-story building in Ramat Gan, close to the Ayalon Highway. Initial reports say that there were no casualties and no one is believed to be trapped inside the building. The fire broke out on the 9th floor and spread to the 10 floors inside the building. Police succeeded in evacuating residents from the building, including some who were taken off the roof in a crane. Roads to the area have been sealed off to traffic. In local finance, shares were down across the board on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, while the shekel was mixed in foreign currency trading. Here are the numbers. Taking a look at the weather, and the forecast calls for more of the same sunny and hot conditions, and a heat wave is expected in parts of the country. Here are the expected highs and lows at home and abroad for the next 24 hours.